Oyster Reef in the mouth of the Caloosahatchee. We showed you how shells buried for 1 million years are cleaning our water today.
Off the coast of Cedar Key, Florida, something happened underwater that scientists are still trying to fully explain.
Built by marine scientists with the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation.
A team of researchers tipped tons of rock and shell into a bay where oyster reefs had collapsed by almost 90%.
We've lost 90% of our oyster reefs, and a lot of those reefs were directly just put on barges and used for roadways.
They walked away expecting failure. Within months, life had taken hold in ways no model had predicted, and what grew back from that Dead Sea floor changed everything. A reef that refused to die. In late September of 2024, Hurricane Helene roared into the Florida Big Bend with winds near 140 miles per hour, and Cedar Key took a storm surge of nearly 12 feet.
Florida was rocked by Helene's first punch, making landfall late Thursday as a dangerous Category 4 hurricane with 140-mile-per-hour winds.
That number alone is staggering because it broke the record set just 1 year earlier by Hurricane Idalia. Houses came off their foundations. Boats ended up in trees on barrier islands a quarter-mile from shore. Cedar Key clam farmer Tim Solano walked his lease the next morning and described what he saw as a bomb going off. And he admitted he got teary because he had 3 kids and had put everything into that farm. Yet a few miles offshore, something quietly did not break. A long, low chain of constructed reef sitting at the mouth of the Suwannee River absorbed wave after wave of that storm and held. Researchers from the University of Florida, who had spent years building it, returned by boat once the water calmed and confirmed that the reef structure was still there. Oysters were still alive on the rock. The shellfish had ridden out a Category 4 hurricane and stayed exactly where they were placed. For the people who built that reef, this was the moment that confirmed everything they had argued for. They had watched a generation of conventional restoration projects fail across Florida. They had taken a different path, and now even the worst storm Cedar Key had seen in modern memory was not enough to undo the work they had done. But to understand why this reef survived when so many others had been wiped out, we have to go back to a time when this entire stretch of coast looked like it was finished, when the bay where this reef now stands was nothing but a sandbar, and when nobody outside of a tiny university field station believed it could ever be reversed. A coast that was disappearing. If you had taken a boat out into Suwannee Sound around 2010, you would have seen something deeply unsettling for anyone who knew its history. The intertidal oyster reefs that had defined this coastline for thousands of years were vanishing. Some of these reefs were 3,000 years old, built shell by shell across centuries, by generations of oysters. By the early years of the new century, they were shrinking at a rate of roughly 8 centimeters of vertical elevation per year. They were turning in slow motion into open sandbars. Studies by University of Florida researchers documented that intertidal oyster reefs in the Suwannee Sound region had declined by 66% between the early 1980s and the year 2011. And that decline kept going. Some areas saw oyster counts drop by more than 200% over the following decade. Across the entire Big Bend region, oyster populations had collapsed by almost 90% in just 30 years. The cause was not a single event. It was a slow tightening of pressures. Drought cycles became more severe. Upstream water withdrawals from the Suwannee River reduced the flow of fresh water reaching the coast. Salinity levels rose and stayed high for longer than the oysters could tolerate. As reefs began to die, they lost the ability to rebuild themselves. The dead shell broke apart. The structure flattened. And once the reef became sandbar, baby oysters drifting in the currents had nowhere to attach. The system was caught in a feedback loop, sliding downward year by year. This was not unique to Cedar Key either. About 100 miles to the west, in Apalachicola Bay, an even more famous oyster fishery was collapsing in real time. By 2012, after the lowest river flows ever recorded, that fishery cratered. The state of Florida went so far as to sue the state of Georgia at the United States Supreme Court, arguing that water consumption upstream was killing the oysters downstream. Florida lost that case in 2021. The Supreme Court ruled that the state had not proven its argument. By that point, what was once one of the great oyster bays in America was empty of natural reefs. A 5-year wild harvest moratorium was in place. So when researchers stood on the deck of a small boat in Suwannee Sound and looked at what was left of Lone Cabbage Reef, they were staring at the same fate creeping towards Cedar Key. Everything that had been tried elsewhere had failed. Every conventional approach to oyster restoration had quietly burned through millions of dollars without bringing the reefs back. And that was when a small team at the University of Florida decided to throw the playbook out entirely. The idea that everyone doubted. The conventional wisdom for restoring oyster reefs had stayed roughly the same for decades. You raised oyster larvae in a hatchery. You attached them to old shell. You scattered that shell across the bottom of the bay and waited for nature to do the rest. Across Florida, more than $14 million had been spent on this approach in places like Apalachicola Bay, Suwannee Sound, and St. Andrew Bay. Almost none of it had brought the reefs back. Dr. Bill Pine and Dr. Peter Frederick at the University of Florida looked at all of those failures and asked a question almost nobody else was willing to ask. They asked whether the entire premise was wrong. What if oyster larvae were not actually the limiting factor at all? What if the problem was something far simpler and far more physical? They began running pilot studies along Lone Cabbage Reef. They started counting oyster larvae floating in the water column, and they kept finding plenty of them. The bay was still producing wild oyster spat. There were millions of tiny would-be oysters drifting through Suwannee Sound looking for a place to settle. The bottleneck was not biology. The bottleneck was real estate. There was nowhere left for them to land. The reefs had collapsed into sandbars, and oyster larvae cannot attach to sand. This is where the team made their unconventional bet. Instead of relying on hatcheries, they would assume the larvae would arrive on their own if a suitable surface was provided. They would not try to replicate a natural reef using delicate calc alone, because every project that had tried that had failed. Instead, they would build something that mimicked exactly what nearby healthy reefs looked like. They sourced locally quarried dolomite limestone, the same kind of rock that supports living reefs in nearby Wakasasa Bay. They chose boulders ranging from 6 to 36 inches across, deliberately mixing sizes to create gaps and crevices similar to what you would see on a wild reef. They calculated the precise elevation of nearby healthy reefs and pledged to match it stone for stone. The funding came from a source nobody could have predicted. After the Deepwater Horizon oil spill of 2010, BP and Transocean paid billions of dollars in settlements, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation channeled some of that money into Gulf restoration. A roughly $8.3 million award flowed to the Lone Cabbage Project. Oil money, in other words, would help rebuild oyster reefs that nobody else had managed to save. And in the summer of 2018, the barges started moving. The build and the boat cruise. The construction phase took only about 2 months, but the planning that went into those 2 months had taken nearly a decade. The team did something unusual for a university project. They hired multi-generational Cedar Key oyster harvesters as paid project staff, including a man named Jerry Beckham, an oyster woman named Laura Adams, and a harvester named Garrett Sims. These were people whose families had worked these waters for generations. Before any rock was placed, more than 60 Cedar Key oystermen went out and physically relocated 3,150 bushels of live oysters from inside the construction zone to safe areas of the Sound. They did this by hand, bushel by bushel, so that no living oyster would be buried under the new substrate. The dolomite limestone was mined at a quarry in Branford, Florida, then trucked to the coast and loaded onto barges. The team placed 12,917 cubic meters of stone across 26 constructed reef pads stretching about 3 miles, following the line of the original 1,800-year-old historic reef. On top of that limestone, they layered approximately 1 inch of recycled oyster and clam shell, providing the rough, textured surface that would attract microbial colonization and oyster larvae alike. The economic ripple was real. According to a peer-reviewed analysis published in 2022, the project supported 44 full-time and part-time jobs, generated over $1 million in labor income, and produced more than $5 million in total industry output for this small coastal economy. Local welders, boat operators, deckhands, and divers were paid for their work. The community had a direct stake in seeing the reef succeed. Dr. Bill Pine summarized the philosophy behind the entire build in just a few sentences. He said the team learned from the pilot project that oyster recovery was limited by available substrate and not by oyster spat. He said they mimicked what they observed naturally occurring in the system, using the same type of limestone found in nearby healthy areas, and built the reef to the same elevation as healthy natural reefs in Suwannee Sound. They were not trying to outsmart the bay. They were trying to listen to it. When the last barge moved off, the reef was complete. The construction team retreated. The science team set up monitoring stations, and then they waited to see whether the wild oyster larvae of Suwannee Sound, which had been drifting and dying for years with nowhere to settle, would actually find their new home. What happened next moved faster than anyone had projected, and the reason came down to something most people never see and never think about: the microscopic workforce that built a reef. In the first weeks after the limestone settled into place, almost nothing was visible to the naked eye. To divers and fishermen, the reef looked exactly like what it was: a long line of stone resting on the bay floor. There were no oysters. There were no fish stacked around it. There were no obvious signs of life at all. But underneath that surface stillness, an enormous biological process was already underway, and it was happening at a scale invisible to anyone not looking through a microscope. Within days of being submerged, bacteria began colonizing the limestone. These were not random microbes. Marine bacteria from groups including Pseudo-Alteramonas and Alteramonas began forming biofilms across the rock surface. These biofilms produced specific chemical signals that oyster larvae are biologically programmed to detect. One of those signals is ammonia, which oyster veliger larvae use as a cue that adult oyster communities are nearby. Another involves surface-bound polysaccharide and lipid compounds that act almost like a chemical handshake between the substrate and any drifting larva that happens to brush against it. The limestone itself was doing chemical work as well. Made primarily of calcium carbonate, it slowly released calcium ions into the surrounding water and created tiny localized zones of slightly more alkaline chemistry. For calcifying organisms like oysters, barnacles, and tube worms, those zones are exactly what they need to begin building their own shells. The reef was not just a passive surface. It was actively producing the conditions for its own colonization. Within a few months, oyster spat began appearing on the new reef. Dr. Peter Frederick and his team also noticed something else they did not initially expect. The reef was acting as what they later called a leaky dam, holding back fresh water flowing out of the Suwannee River and creating a brackish zone behind it. They measured salinity differences of up to 90% between the riverside and the Gulf side of certain reef segments. The brackish pool that formed behind the reef was estimated to be more than 7 times larger than the reef itself. Frederick was honest about the limits of this finding. While the leaky dam effect was real at small scale, monitoring stations across the broader sound did not show that this single reef chain had measurably altered salinity across the entire region. The reef was doing real work, but it was not large enough to fix the entire system on its own. By the third year of monitoring, the numbers were extraordinary. Oyster densities on the constructed substrate were running roughly 9 times higher than at unrestored control sites in the same waters. On areas of the reef where the team had placed bagged clamshell on top of the limestone, oyster densities were running 14 times higher than controls. Bird abundance around the reef increased by 62% overall, and for some species, including bald eagles, the increase was as much as 500%. Later research published in 2025 found that across the full restored reef, oyster densities were running 10 to 20 times higher than at unrestored sites, and that the reef pads were holding their target elevations across multiple years of storms and tides. But the real test of whether this reef could survive long-term was not about oyster counts in calm water. It was about what happened when the storms came. A coast tested by 3 hurricanes. Between 2023 and 2024, the Florida Big Bend was hit by 3 named hurricanes in just 13 months. For a community of fewer than 800 people on a chain of small islands 4 miles offshore, this was an existential test. In late August of 2023, Hurricane Idalia made landfall at Keaton Beach, about 70 miles northwest of Cedar Key. It had briefly reached Category 4 offshore, fueled by Gulf waters around 88 degrees Fahrenheit, before coming ashore at Category 3. Cedar Key took a 7-foot storm surge, which at the time was the highest the town had ever recorded. Roughly 1/3 of buildings on the island were flooded. In August of 2024, Hurricane Debbie came through as a Category 1. Then, in late September of that same year, Helene arrived, and Helene was different. Its surge at Cedar Key reached around 12 feet, a number that surpassed even Idalia. 40 or more homes were destroyed or badly damaged. Statewide damages from Helene were estimated by analysts at nearly $14 billion. Through all of it, the lone cabbage reef held. The most recent peer-reviewed analysis described the substrate as remaining resilient, with sampling and visual reconnaissance showing the reef function had not been disrupted. Living shorelines built using the same restoration philosophy along Cedar Key itself also performed remarkably well. A research scientist at the Nature Coast Biological Station, Savannah Barry, surveyed those shorelines after Idalia and noted that while the storm had been overwhelming, the living shorelines had taken relatively little damage. The contrast with the human side of Cedar Key was painful. Tim Solano, the clam farmer, lost roughly 80% of his annual harvest to Helene. Statewide aquaculture losses from Idalia alone topped $34 million. Jerry Beckham, who now serves as president of the Cedar Key Oystermen's Association, explained simply that fishermen, oystermen, and clammers were all just resilient, and they would rebuild. Solano put it more bluntly. He said Mother Nature was a business partner you could not control. What this storm cycle proved, in a way no calm water study ever could, was that engineered limestone reefs built to mimic natural systems can survive the kind of weather that increasingly defines this coast. That has implications far beyond Cedar Key. The honest reckoning. It would be easy to end this story with celebration, and there is real reason to celebrate. Lone Cabbage Reef is now widely regarded as the most successful oyster restoration project in Florida history. It has changed how scientists, funders, and communities think about how reefs can be brought back. Similar approaches are being studied and adapted in places like Mobile Bay in Alabama, the harbor restoration projects of New York City, the shellfish reef pilots of Port Phillip Bay in Australia, and the ongoing native flat oyster recovery work across the North Sea in Europe. The truth is that lone cabbage replaces only about 3 to 4% of the regional oyster reef area that has been lost in this part of Florida since the 1980s. The Suwannee River freshwater problem that drove the original collapse has not been solved, because solving it would require coordination across multiple states, the Army Corps of Engineers, and decades of agricultural water management decisions that are far beyond what any restoration project can fix. Climate change is increasing the frequency and intensity of the hurricanes hitting this coast, and warming waters are stressing oysters and clams alike. And yet, what Cedar Key has shown the rest of the world is that ecosystem recovery is possible when you stop trying to engineer nature and start trying to give nature back the conditions it needs to engineer itself. The work succeeded because the team took multi-generational fishermen seriously, listened to what they had observed, and built something that matched what the bay had once produced on its own. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me whether you think nature can keep doing this kind of work everywhere we let it.